Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malaman in the Highland Park, New Jersey, Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky on Chesed, New York City, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter, Day School, Long Island. It's great to see you. This is the last Parsha of Bereishit. I don't want to let it go. I don't want to let Bereishit go. I love this book. This is our family story. We'll talk about it. We have to get right in because there's just so much material. We are dealing with some of the deep themes here. It's the passing of a generation. It's the death of Yaakov. Let's do the low-hanging fruit here. At the beginning of the Parsha, Yaakov insists that he be buried in the land of Israel. Can you talk to this for a second? Jeremy, what's this about? What's behind this? What's going on the surface? What do you think is going on beneath the surface?
I think I've alluded to this one fact in previous conversations, especially on Parashat Vayehi. I like to mention this because I think this is a really illustrative piece of Torah. When David buys Goren Ornan, he buys the site that will be the Beit HaMikdash, he pays 50 shekel kesef, 50 coins of silver. And when Abraham buys the Me'arat HaMachpelah, the cave that will be the burial cave, he pays 400 shekel kesef. He pays literally 8 times the amount for the space that will be the ancestral grave over the space that will be the temple. There's lots of reasons to be connected to the power of this story. Some of them are about God's teaching, and that's the Torah. That's the conventionally religious aspects of Judaism. It's the Torah, it's the mitzvot, it's worship. It's symbolized on the Beit HaMikdash. Some part about it is family and land and ancestral connection. Owning your burial place, there's like nothing more tribal and communal and familial than we are all lying together in this earth. So Jacob, who is destined to be buried in Me'arat HaMachpelah, even though we know that he loves Rachel more, Rachel is his true wife. When Judah, just at the last Parsha, Judah says in this heartbreaking way to the Joseph he doesn't yet recognize, that Jacob, his father, said, "My wife gave me 2 children." Well, what do you mean your wife gave you? You had lots of wives, and my mother Leah gave you 6 children, 6 sons and a daughter. But Jacob loves Rachel, but he doesn't want to be buried next to Rachel. He wants to be buried in the ancestral homeland in Kiryat Arba, Hebron, Me'arat HaMachpelah. This is the sense that he belongs to this tribe, to this chain of past and future that is Abraham and Isaac, that is Sarah and Rebecca and Leah. And so he's got to go there.
Barry, how do you see this?
So I think, to add to what Jeremy said so eloquently, this is a kind of homecoming for Jacob. Jacob is, in a sense, like his grandfather Abraham, traveled a lot. Abraham, we remember, came from Ur Kasdim, stopped in Haran, made his way into the land of Israel, Eretz Canaan, and then goes down to Egypt and comes back up. Jacob is born in Eretz Israel, but he does go east, fleeing from his brother, marrying the 2 sisters, acquiring the 2 other wives, having his children. And then he too has to go down to Egypt, and he wants to make sure that he will continue the chain of tradition set by his grandfather, and if not in life, at least in death, to come up from the land of Egypt. So he's going to go to Me'arat HaMachpelah because that is the eternal Israelite possession. That is where our history in the land begins, because that is the first place that Abraham actually possessed as his. He paid for it.
It's hard not to see also just a little hint of contempt for Egypt. I don't want to be buried in this spot, for all the reasons that both of you said, which is I have this ancestral yearning and I want to be connected to family, but you know what? I don't belong here. And there is, I think that tension of where do you belong is really running through this story. It's on so many levels. And And just one other footnote about Jacob here. He makes Joseph swear to this in a way that just like, yeah, Dad, it's not going to work. It's like, no, swear to this. Promise me you'll do this. Take a binding oath to this, which tells me, just in the frame of this is a man who's approaching his end. There's still a lot of the old Jacob there. I love this idea that this guy, he's 147 years old, but you know what? There's still a lot of him going.
So
can I say one thing about? I've been making my way through all those biblical books that I haven't ever studied closely. So I've been making my way through the prophets, and I've been reading Yirmiyahu. It's titanic book, and Yirmiyahu, is living in the destruction. Nebuchadnezzar is ravaging all the Middle East, and Nebuchadnezzar is destroying the Beit HaMikdash. And Jeremiah has an overwhelming message for the survivors of the Churban. You guys should stay in Eretz Yisrael, or you should go to Bavel, but you should not go to Egypt. This is the terrible thing. Do not go to Egypt. Egypt is the worst. And in fact, he's with a group of people who just survived the assassination of Gedaliah, for whom we fast. And they say, ask God, ask God what we should do. And comes back with the message, says, whatever you do, go to Bavel, stay in Eretz Yisrael, just don't go to Egypt. They say, no, we're going to Egypt anyway. And they take him forcibly and bring him to Egypt. But I was struck, the Bible in Yirmiyahu there did not make explicit reference to Egyptian slavery, but the just natural or almost instinctive or cultural, whatever you say, revulsion, no Egypt. You'd think that he would be madder at Bavel. Bavel has just destroyed the temple. No, Bavel's part of the plan. Egypt, no way.
I think there is a revulsion, and we can see clues of that in the way that there's disdain for Egypt. Mizeh, take us out of this place. Name the place. Okay, so we're moving on. Jacob gets Joseph to promise this, and then we're moving into the first of the deathbed scenes where the adoption of Joseph's sons takes place. Barry, you want to describe this for us? What is happening here, and give us a bit of a theory as to what is taking place here in terms of Jacob's adoption of Joseph's children.
So Jacob is on his deathbed, and Joseph brings his sons so they can be blessed. And we have to remember that Joseph's sons have an Egyptian mother. Presumably they have Egyptian names, and they've only known the land of Egypt. They have not known the land of Canaan. And Joseph presents his sons to his father for his blessing. And Jacob at first is wondering who these people are. And Joseph tells him that they are my sons Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob goes to bless them. And even though Joseph has presented Manasseh as the firstborn and Ephraim as the secondborn, as the Torah records their birth order, Jacob switches his hands and puts his hand on signifying the elder son on Ephraim and the one signifying the younger son on Manasseh. And Joseph is kind of perturbed and says, this is not the way we do things here. Just like his uncle Lavan had told him told Jacob, we don't do things like that in Aram Naharaim either. And Jacob says, no, this is how we do things.
I love that.
I think this is actually a very profound comment on one of the difficulties with the Torah tradition. Our heroes tend to be the youngest or the second born. Very few firstborn children make it in a way that we want to emulate, Abraham being the notable exception, perhaps. But Joseph, who, even though he's a firstborn of his mother Rachel, is the 11th child. He's pretty far down on the pecking order. And even though he's second in command to Pharaoh, he's still second to Pharaoh. He's not the first in the land. But like a lot of other people, when they come from behind, come from out of nowhere, they want to reinstitute the pattern that existed before. So now Joseph, he's made it. he wants to be recognized as the firstborn, and he wants his firstborn to get the firstborn blessing. And Jacob says no, that blessing is not determined by birth order, it's determined by the grace of God. And I think that we have to understand that this is part of God's plan as well, because the boys will be blessed with the name of God.
So is it possible to see in this moment a cultural conflict between, the Jacob culture, which we're going to call Jewish culture, and the Egyptian culture also? You think so?
I think it's more of a human thing. One of my great loves is medieval English history. A lot of conflict, a lot of kings. One is worse than the other. How can you not love this stuff? And as we know, when you're second born in the medieval monarchy, you're kind of out of luck. The only way you could make a good life for yourself is either to accept your fate kindly or to kill the king. And then you can become the king. But once you become the king, you don't want the next generation to be the best man standing. You want it to be your oldest son. That's just how we do things. We lack a kind of consistency that we want from other people, but do not want to impose on ourselves. And I think this is, Joseph is supposed to understand here that he, in fact, is a youngest son, not an older son. And this is
Yadati b'ni Yadati. I know. And again, I want to say, this is Jacob, the old Jacob being Yaakov Avinu. He is like, it's going to be my way.
But I think slightly different, because while I think it is quite correct, you were sort of pointing to Yosef as being a somewhat marginal figure in terms of the Jewishness. I mean, he has grown up, by this time he's lived more in Egypt than he did in Canaan. I think Moshe and Joseph are very interesting characters because they are sort of mirror images of each other, both partly Egyptian, both partly Israelite and the boundaries. But in this case, I don't think that explains the conflict here between Jacob and Joseph, or their miscommunication. I think that the general thrust of all of these second-born stories is normal life goes by primogeniture. Redemptive moments come when primogeniture is unseated. And I would say that with Isaac and Ishmael, with Jacob and Esau, and now once again, there's a parent who sort of expects things to be the regular way. You want it to be the regular way, and you want order to be maintained. But there are redemptive moments in which the typical order gets unseated, and this is one of them. Joseph says, Lavan says to Jacob, back with the Leah Rachel episode, this is not how we do things. We do things the right way. And Jacob has to follow along, and he does the right way, the quote unquote right way. And here too, Joseph is saying, no, let's do things the right way. And he says, I know what the right way is, but this moment calls for the wrong way.
Indeed. Okay, so the next centerpiece of the Parsha is the blessing that Jacob gives to his sons. It's a very complicated, poetic, and very, very compressed set of verses, highly charged with lots of different themes, which deserve really hours and hours of conversation. But I want to go skipping over that blessing. Let's go to the death scene of Jacob. Vayechal Yaakov letzavot et banav. Jacob is completed, blessing his children. Vayesof raglav el hamita. He puts his feet back into bed, because he was sitting up in bed while doing this, 147 years old. Venithazek al hamita. He's like showing his strength, another aspect of the old Jacob. He's got a lot of physical strength. Vayigva vayasef el hamav. He expires like a book. He expires. And he's gathers his people. And of course, you know what it doesn't say? It doesn't say vayamot. It doesn't say that he died. To which Rashi says, Yaakov Avinu lo met, right? Quoting the Talmud. And Shlomo Carlebach immortalized.
Translate. Yaakov Avinu lo met.
Yaakov Avinu. Our father Jacob didn't die. Like in The Princess Bride, where Miracle Max says,
He's not dead. He's not all the way completely dead.
Mostly dead.
Mostly dead.
Mostly dead means slightly alive. No, but Jacob is mostly dead. But Od Avinu Chai, as the song goes, our father yet lives, said Shlomo Carbuck in Od Avinu Chai, right? It's a reference to this. So it's a lovely, lovely moment of understanding that the lives of our ancestors live on with us as they are bound into the bonds of life, say Rahman.
Right, but this is what happens when people don't always understand poetry and metaphor.
Indeed.
Because when it says Vayikva and Vayasef el Aviv, whatever the exact words are, that means he died.
He died.
Of course it means he died, but
so you have to ask yourself, I think, for a moment, what Rashi is really doing by saying that Jacob didn't die. It doesn't always serve us well. I understand Midrash has its own
rubric,
its own way of expressing itself. But one of the dangers is someone afterwards takes it the wrong way and says, "Oh, says Jacob didn't die, he must still be alive."
Yes,
and that doesn't always serve us well.
Okay, fine.
Listen, the people can be crudely pashtani. They could be crudely literalist, and yes, they can lose the poetry. But I would say that the rabbis who make such a drash. I mean, first of all, the Talmud is so charming about this. It says Tractate Tanit. It says Yaakov Avinu lo met, and then it says, well, then. Why did they embalm him and eulogize him? And then the Talmud continues and says, no, you don't understand what I meant. I meant mazaro kayam afu kayam. As long as his descendants live, so he too lives. So it is clear that it is a poetic figure, but it's also true, and I love this about Midrash, that in reading quote unquote hyper literally, they discover the little slippery spaces in between the words and what it might mean. So, because this is not, for the rabbis, normal human speech that just like has a semantic, normal human speech, you says something and it means what it says, but divine speech is like omni-significant, everything matters, all the pieces have something to say, and the very fact that it shows Vayigva Vayasef el Amav as opposed to Vayamocham, it must mean something.
Right, so this is reminiscent of the disagreement between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And, Rabbi Ishmael tended to be more of a modernist in the sense he said language has rules, and the rules of the language dictate how we understand it. Rabbi Akiva was much more imaginative, but again, it didn't always serve the Jewish people well. It made for some very interesting, nuanced discussions of biblical text, but it also may have been responsible for leading the people astray. And I think we have to be aware of that. But it seems, Jeremy, that you find more favor with Rabbi Akiva and perhaps me with Rabbi Ishmael.
Well, I do think you're referring to, it's not just Heschel, but it is certainly true that this is a major theme of Abraham Joshua Heschel's book. In Hebrew, we say Torah min hashamayim ba'aspaklaria shel adorot. Translated into English by Gordon Tucker as Heavenly Torah through the prism of the generations or something like that. And by the way, this coming week, Monday or Tuesday is
Heschel.
Yeah. The 49th yahrzeit of Heschel, and next year will be the 50th. So
last gate of wisdom.
He has these two images, like you said, of Rabbi Ishmael, the relatively rationalist, and Rabbi Akiva, the relative mystic. And the whole point of that Heavenly Torah book is that these two are the double helix of Judaism, and they both wind together. And I want them both. I don't want to have to pick one. And I will promiscuously jump from one to the other when necessary.
I agree. I think we can be promiscuous here. Okay, so let's go back to.
Unfortunately, I can't say what I want to say because of the.
So we are. So Joseph's in a bind here, and Jacob has made him promise to take him up and bury him in the land of Canaan, and it's not so easy for him to get permission to go out. And I think the Torah wants us to appreciate exactly what kind of bind he's in. He sends a missive to Pharaoh. He really, basically begs Pharaoh permission to.
Well, it's kind of obsequious, his approach, right? And I think we get, this is, I think you mentioned this earlier, Elliot. This is really the chink in the armor, because Joseph is not quite the second in command. He's just lower down on the totem pole, and he's being pushed down.
All right. So what do you make of the fact that the family goes up, but they leave the children behind? There's a big procession, and Egypt also sends like the entire government, the Congress, the Supreme Court, everybody to go up to Canaan and bury him, and they leave the women and children. They leave the children behind. What do you make of that, Barry?
Well, it's not a good thing. But I'm reminded from a personal moment that when my mother's father died, I was 8 years old, or 7 years old, and I didn't go to the funeral because my mother said I was too young. So there could be an element of that, but I think in the context of the story, it's clear they're being left as a pledge because Pharaoh is only letting him go to bury his father. Yeah. He wants to make sure that he comes back.
Yeah.
And, what's interesting is Pharaoh, certainly from our point of view, I think is an outsider in Egypt, but he's an outsider that the Pharaoh needs. And he's going to do whatever it takes to make sure he comes back. And what better pledge than to keep your kids?
Okay, so they go up, they bury him, and there's this moment afterwards where the brothers have to kind of resolve everything. We don't want to go into that. Well, let's go now to the final scene of the Parsha and the final scene of the book. And Jeremy, pick it up for us at the end here. It's very emotional. It's a very profound moment. So take us to the end of the book and the end of the Parsha, and let's try and uncover the real theme here, which is how do we get redeemed from this mess?
Yeah, well, there's a really sad moment. I mean, you kind of alluded to it.
Yeah.
After Jacob is dead, they've now returned. The brothers say, "Oh, listen, before he died, remember, Abba gave this requirement that you not kill us." They're still very, very guilty, and Joseph, who is given to great emotion, weeps again. He says, "I'm not going to kill you. I never intended to kill you. You did try to harm me, but God planned it for good, and this has all worked out reasonably well. And so, no, I really am reconciled to you. I really am." And so he reassures them. It says, "Vayinachem otam vaydaber al libam." He speaks to their heart, and so they remain. And that's a lovely moment of reconciliation. And he lives and he sees another generations, but there's dark clouds on the horizon. This book really, with the exception perhaps of Shmot, I would say Shmot ends on an excellent note. The tabernacle has been built and God's presence fills it. But the other books all end on a somewhat dark note. This one ends also that Joseph says to them, "Listen, I'm about to die, but one day, pakod yifkod Elohim etchem ve'elatchem min ha'aretz hazot." One day, God is going to take care of you and bring you out of this land, this land where we don't want to be, and return you to the land that God had sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This where we are now is in some sense profoundly negative, or at least it's going to get very negative. It's the foreshadowing of what's about to happen. And Joseph makes them also swear that when God takes notice of you, you have to take my bones too. So you're going to have to bury me back also in the land of Israel. And Joseph dies, and he's embalmed and put in a coffin. So the Parsha ends in death, but it also ends in this awareness that there is some future burial place back in the sacred land, back in the land sworn to the ancestors, and they're not there now. Now, presumably, if Yosef was so all that, if he was the most powerful guy and had given instructions to Pharaoh's court, he said, listen, when I die, just like my father did, X many years ago, however long it was, couldn't have been that long. Jacob dies at 147, Joseph dies at 110. How much time is there in
90
between?
something years between the two of them. So
How many?
Jacob is something like 95, 93 when Joseph is born. So at 110, Joseph, it's about 60 years later, 50 years later.
Okay, it's conceivably still within somebody's memory. And if he had said, listen, remember what we did, 60 years ago, I want the same treatment for me. I want everybody to lead me up and bury me in the land of Israel. You kind of think maybe he could have pulled that off, but it's not what happens, right? What happens is this warning that one day we're going to have a redemptive moment and you're going to take me out. And when that happens, bring my bones with you. But until then, the exile factor, the fact that we're here in Egypt, where we don't really want to be for too long, we can't leave yet, but someday we're gonna leave, and then my bones go with you.
Right. So I think what's important to emphasize here is that Joseph may walk like an Egyptian and he will die like an Egyptian because he is going to be embalmed and put in this ark, but he's going to be buried as an Israelite. And I think that is of profound importance because no matter how you leave, you come back home. And this is really the message for the Israelites. And I think it highlights for us the significance of Joseph's bones, which are going to appear two more times in the Tanakh. Once in, I think, Parashat Shalach, where it says that Moshe took Joseph's bones with him. And again, at the end of the book of Joshua, where they're going to be buried in the land of Israel. And those bones are the people's only physical connection to the land until they get there, right? Because after a few generations, no one remembers being in the land of Israel. And so they have Joseph's bones, and it's a physical sign of God's promise. And one last point, if I may, it occurred to me earlier when we were talking about Jacob making Joseph swear. So what's the difference between the oath and Joseph just saying, okay, I promise? The oath has God's name in it, and it's a sign of God's promise. And that also is important here because the Torah, especially in sometimes very overt, but also in covert ways, always emphasizes for us God's role in human destiny. And we have to pay attention to that.
So both of you have given very profound meanings and deep meanings. I'd like to be a little shallower here. Okay.
Please.
Have some fun.
And what I want to say is that there are a lot of unresolved things with Joseph, and that he so much wants to be a patriarch, and he just can't be. And he aspires to this, and he does exactly what his father did, which is his father made him swear to bring his bones up, so he's making his brothers swear. And what I want to say is that as sad as the ending of Bereishit is, it's also a little, it's unsettling in the sense that some of the stuff between Joseph and his brothers, most of it is resolved, but there's a little residue that it remains, and that little residue, I think, is going to sustain or be sustained throughout the history of biblical Israel. We know that there are problems later on between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. We know that forget going that far. We're going to go next week into Shemot. It's not that there's a conflict between they do become a nation, and Shemot is the book where the people emerges as a people, but it's not complete. We don't get a happy ending with Bereishit, is what we're all saying. It's a sad ending. The ending is an ending in a coffin, in a lead coffin, as the Midrash says, and he is a mummified in Egypt. There is resolution, but there's not resolution. He is aspiring to be a patriarch. He's not a patriarch. The end of God's appearance in that way is over. This is the formative moment of the family. It's done. And now, so let's get to the coda, which is, we are finished now. We've completed another year of reading our family story. It's a milestone in our lives. and it's, I mean, we've enjoyed, these dozen weeks with our family. This is, we make it very personal. We're inside this story, and that's what the Torah demands of us. That's what makes the Torah great. It really asks of us to be there on the journey back to Egypt, to be there with Joseph in the room when he reveals himself, to be there, on his dying breath. We're there, and now, I don't want to give it up. I don't want to let it go.
The only thing that I cannot understand of what you just said
Yes.
is why you led into that with, I'm going to be a little shallow. There's nothing shallow about that.
Well, it's shallow because I think the shallow part is the envy, right? He envies his father. And the brothers envy him, and that I find is a coarser instinct.
Okay, so here I think we have to consider something, and what I think part of the genius of the Torah is to recognize that what makes Sefer Bereishit Torah is that it is actually followed by Sefer Shemot. Bereishit is not a standalone book. We have a tendency to see the 5 books as individual books. They each have their narrative arc, clearly a beginning, clearly an end. But what makes Bereishit really part of our Torah is that immediately it's going to be followed by Sefer Shemot.
Yeah.
And that is the book of redemption. So even though things are very bad as we end Parasha Vayehi, the end of Sefer Bereishit, we're going to enter the process of redemption next week, if we should all live so long and be well.
We will all live long and be well. We'll be fine.
We can live that long.
Well,
that long we can live.
We got some hardship to go through before we get redeemed, though. We got a few parshas.
But again, because we know the book, we're not reading it for the first time. We know we're on the path to redemption.
We're on the path to redemption. What a great way to end it. Look, we're ending Vayehi. We're ending this whole book. This is a milestone for the 3 of us. It's a milestone for our listeners and viewers for whom we are so grateful. We can't thank you enough for sharing this time with us and enjoying the discussion and the conversation. Please reach out to us. Please write to us. We welcome your feedback, your emails. And on behalf of my buddies, we're going to say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Chizko, venithazek.
Hazak Hazak, that's right. See you next week, another edition of Parasha Talk.